Welcome back. So this is part two of the Baratie arc deep dive, and I'm going to focus mostly on Don Krieg today. And I want to start by looking at Don Krieg's name. Now, Don is usually used for authority, but something that is given to someone and their power is socially recognized. So, for example, like in the Mafia or Don Quixote de la Mancha, which is a book that I have talked about in other deep dives. And then Krieg in German means war. Now, these two words put together are really interesting when we look at the kind of villain that Don Krieg is. He does not want community, he wants compliance. And his authority is not earned through any sort of moral credibility, but it is created through intimidation and violence. Now, his arrival into the arc is quite interesting. So he arrives at Baratie already defeated. So his fleet has been shattered. His body is failing. So he's not introduced as a triumphant pirate lord. And I think Baratie is the perfect stage for a villain like Krieg. Now, I want to bring up a book that I absolutely love. It is called Animal Farm. Napoleon rules through control of resources, enforcement through violence, and this constant state of fear. So, fear of starvation, fear of enemies, fear of being cast out. And this is very much like the way Krieg rules his ship and his crew. Now, Krieg does have Gin, who is very loyal to him, but his crew essentially follows him because they are trapped within his system. And hunger and violence really act as the boundaries that keep that hierarchy intact. And the moment that Krieg becomes the hungry one, it's really revealed what he truly believes. So he does not see hunger as a shared human condition that creates obligation, which is the antithesis to Baratie. Now, Baratie runs on a single absolute that no one leaves hungry, no one is denied food. And this is not presented as kindness, but rather a law of civilization. The cooks don't feed people because they feel generous. They feed people because refusing food turns the world into something unlivable. Now, many cultures and religions around the world, including Confucianism and Islam, societies really survive through shared practices that preserve our humanity. And food often sits at the center of this because food is what makes life possible. And to deny food is to deny someone belonging and humanity. And to share food is to affirm that someone is still human, still inside that moral boundary of society. And so when Krieg enters Baratie, he is confronted with a system that he cannot understand because his worldview assumes the opposite. For Krieg, food is leverage, hunger is weakness, and weakness deserves exploitation. And so the moment that Krieg really becomes a true villain is not his poison gas or his armor. It is the act of begging for food, receiving it, recovering, and then betraying the people who gave him food. I will be talking about the Iliad and Odyssey in Arlong Park, but I think it's also really relevant in Baratie as well, because in classic literature, such as the Iliad and the Odyssey, hospitality is a sacred law. I think in English we would say xenia, but this means that providing hospitality to a stranger is to prove that you are civilized, and to accept hospitality and then violate it is not just rude, but it is monstrous. It is not done. And in the Iliad, the Trojan War does not begin because of ambition or territory or even hatred of another group of people. It begins with a violation of this xenia. So Paris is welcomed into Menelaus's house as a guest. He is housed, he is fed, he is protected, and then while he is under that sacred xenia, he steals Helen and flees. This is a huge offense to the laws of civilization, basically. So, to violate hospitality is to fracture that moral order that allows civilization to exist. And so, the Trojan War that follows, it's not simply political retaliation, but rather the inevitable collapse that occurs when that sacred social law is broken. And Krieg does exactly what Paris does. So, he arrives as a guest, he receives food and shelter, and he repays it with betrayal and violence. And so, the moment that he violates Xenia, that conflict becomes unavoidable. And it's really telling that his name kind of shows us what follows is war. And I think Oda is doing something really deliberate here. Krieg is not a man who brings war with him. He is the embodiment of what happens after that hospitality collapses. So Don Krieg, I don't think is named after war because he fights. I think he is named after war because he emerges when ethics fails. So when hospitality is broken, when that hunger becomes leverage, when mercy is exploited, war is what remains. And Zeph's entire philosophy exists to prevent this exact outcome. So his rule, never deny food, it is seen as a kindness, but I think it's more of a preventative ethics. Because once the starving are denied humanity, violence really becomes inevitable. And so Zeph runs Baratie under that same logic that food is really what separates guest from enemy. So the moment that someone is refused bread, they are no longer bound by an obligation of peace. And Krieg then reveals the opposite. So once he attacks after eating, Baratie ceases to be a neutral ground. It is now a site of war. And I think what's really, really interesting is Mihawk's appearance after Krieg's violation of Xenia. And I want to explore Mihawk just a little bit through the lens of the Iliad, since we are already talking about that, particularly through Achilles. Now, Achilles is godlike with overwhelming power, and Achilles single-handedly impacted the outcome of the Trojan War. So when Achilles refused to fight, he withdrew from the battle due to Agamemnon insulting his pride. Thousands were slaughtered. And then after Hector kills his friend, he decides to come back. And that is what ultimately wins the war. So one man has the power to turn the tides of the war. And Mihawk really occupies kind of a similar space in Baratie. He's not introduced as this grand pirate with a huge territory, a big crew, a fancy fleet. He is basically a title. The world's strongest swordsman. That's all he has. And that is enough because Mihawk is the best. Now, in the Iliad, Achilles is not gentle. He is kind of a hero, but he is also not a very great person. He is capable of extreme cruelty, but his violence is never random. It is purposeful, it is directed, and it is governed by his own personal code rather than this hunger for domination. And I think Mihawk really operates in a similar way. Mihawk does not arrive at the Baratie to conquer it or terrorize civilians. It is very singular and specific in that he is pursuing Don Krieg. And then once that pursuit ends, his role in the arc effectively ends as well. He does not escalate the conflict. He does not attempt to impose control over the space. He does not try to kill Don Krieg. He fights Zoro, but he doesn't even kill him. And I think this distinction really matters. So when we look at Krieg, whose violence basically consumes everything around him, Mihawk's power is more precise. So when he duels Zoro, for example, he's not fighting to dominate or humiliate him. And Mihawk's use of a smaller blade initially is also not mockery or even mercy, but rather trying to categorize and measure Zoro. And he feels that Zoro is not yet an enemy that is worthy of his sword. This is really where Mihawk diverges sharply from Don Krieg. Krieg believes violence must be total in order to be effective. So he really overwhelms with numbers and weapons and armor and poison. And I think power to Krieg is something that he must constantly prove through domination. And Mihawk, by contrast, does not need to prove his strength. It is already absolute, so very similar to Achilles in the Iliad. When Achilles appears, the war changes direction. And I think Krieg's ambitions collapse not because Mihawk defeats him directly, but rather because Mihawk reveals just how small Krieg's understanding of true power really is. He simply exists as proof that true power does not need all of this theater that Krieg uses to show how strong he thinks he is. And it's really telling that Krieg responds in the only way that he can, by escalating and being louder and doubling down, which is exactly how false authority behaves when it is exposed. So if you like this deep dive, please let me know what you think about it. There's obviously much more that I can say, and I will be doing other deep dives revisiting these arcs as I get further along in One Piece. But I hope that you guys enjoy this, and I will be posting an Arlong Park deep dive very, very soon.